The man known to history as Gerald Ford was born as Leslie Lynch King on the 14th of July 1913. He came from a troubled family in Omaha, Nebraska, and later grew up in Grand Rapids, Michigan. His father, Leslie Lynch King Sr., was an alcoholic who often flew into violent rages. His mother, Doherty Eyre Garner, was born in 1892. She was just 20 years old when they married in September 1912. Shortly after Leslie was born, his father threatened to kill both his wife and child. Doherty left the family home about 2 weeks later, taking her infant son with her. Such was the unusual beginnings to the life of the 38th President of the United States. Doherty's mother later moved to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where she met and married Gerald Ford Sr. Their son greatly admired his stepfather and, as a teenager, adopted his name. Gerald Ford later went to university in Michigan and later to Yale, where he studied law. He was also a brilliant footballer and played football for the college on many occasions. He graduated from Yale as a lawyer just before the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941. Following year, 1942, Ford joined the US Navy and served on board the Monterey in the South Pacific during the Second World War. After the war, he practiced law in Michigan and became an active member of the Republican Party. In 1948, he married Betty Ann Bloomer. They had 3 sons and a daughter. That same year, he also won a seat in Congress representing the 5th District of Michigan. As a congressman, he was a strong conservative, especially in regard to financial matters. He opposed much of Lyndon B. Johnson's Great Society measures in Congress. By the mid-60s, 1965, he had become the highest-ranking Republican in the House of Representatives as minority leader. Although he was a well-respected member of Congress, by the early 70s he was considering retiring from politics. He had confided such plans to his wife and a few close friends. And then, suddenly, a very dramatic development changed the entire course of his life. In October 1973, the Vice President, Spiro Agnew, was forced to resign due to corruption charges. The President, Richard Nixon, chose the popular Ford as the new Vice President. When Nixon himself was forced out of office the following year in August 1974, Ford suddenly found himself at the very centre of American politics as the 38th president. Gerald Ford got off to an impressive start as president, actually, addressing the nation on television and saying that our long nightmare was over. However, a month later he made the biggest mistake of his presidency. He pardoned Richard Nixon. He was strongly influenced in this regard by Alexander Haig and Secretary of State Henry Kissinger. Both were strong Nixon men. Suddenly, his poll ratings never really fully recovered and cost him probably the election a couple of years later against Jimmy Carter. Nixon had left the White House in disgrace, broken the law. People want to see justice done. Ford had denied them the opportunity, and rumours began to spread of a corrupt bargain between the two men. It seems now, in retrospect, that Nixon aides had convinced Ford that Nixon was suicidal, and the decision was made mainly on humanitarian grounds. However, looking back, many historians believe that Ford's decision was actually the right one. However, people didn't think that way at the time. In the midterm elections of 1974, the Democrats won huge majorities in both houses. Thereafter, they overturned several of Ford's vetoes and weakened him as president. In relation to foreign policy, Ford continued the détente policies begun by Nixon in regard to both the Soviet Union and China. He also signed the Helsinki Accords with the Soviet Union and 34 other nations in August 1976. The Helsinki Accords established the framework for a human rights watch in subsequent years. They also settled some border disputes between various East European countries in the aftermath of the Second World War. However, they were resented by the right wing of the Republican Party as they gave official recognition of Soviet control over countries like Poland. The Accords did not have the status of a treaty and nations were not bound by them. However, they took years to negotiate and helped to create a climate of trust between East and West. The Accords also liberalised trade agreements between East and West and limited the authority of governments in the Soviet bloc to act against their own citizens and thereby promoted democratic procedures there. Some writers actually believe that the Helsinki Accords provided the basis of opposition to Soviet rule in Eastern Europe and led to the collapse of communism there a couple of decades later. In regard to the Middle East, in July 1974, just a month before Gerald Ford became president, Turkey invaded Cyprus following a coup d'etat there by the Greek military junta. There had been ongoing disputes over control of the island between Turkish and Greek separates for decades. However, the invasion of the island actually caused huge strain within NATO, and it also actually caused huge strain within the United States between Congress and the President in regard to how to handle the issue. Congress passed a resolution blocking further American aid to Turkey, but the President vetoed this, fearing that it could weaken Turkey as a major ally in Eastern Europe. Eventually, a compromise solution was reached whereby military aid to Turkey was suspended in February 1975. Elsewhere in the Middle East, the Arab-Israeli conflict was another source of ongoing tension. Since the mid-1960s, Israel had suffered a number of rocket attacks from its Arab neighbours. On the 6th of June 1967, they responded in what became known as the Six-Day War. In less than a week, they captured major areas of territories from their neighbours. Egypt lost the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza Strip. They also captured the West Bank and East Jerusalem from Jordan and the Golan Heights from Syria. This was achieved mainly through American military support and therefore created increased hostility towards the US in these countries. After the war, in August 1967, Arab leaders met and vowed to take a united stance against Israel. They agreed that there would be no peace, no recognition and no negotiation in regard to the occupied territories. 6 years later, in 1973, the Yom Kippur War was an attempt by Egypt, Syria and Jordan to win back their lost territories. However, it failed mainly due also to United States support for Israel. 2 years later, US-Israeli relations also became strained as Israel refused various attempts at a settlement with its Arab neighbours. The Jewish community in the US were very influential in this regard. They got 66 senators, 2/3 of them actually, to write a letter to the president urging him to support Israel. Eventually, the Sinai Agreement was signed in September 1975. This agreement envisaged a peaceful solution to the dispute between Egypt and Israel. Egypt recovered part of the Sinai Peninsula, which was viewed as a betrayal by other Arab nations. The United States had given the Israelis the military means to defeat its Arab neighbours, but later found Israel difficult to manage and thereby strained US-Arab relationships. One of Ford's most difficult challenges was the continuing conflict in Vietnam. The Paris Accords of January 1973 had ended American involvement there. The Accords envisaged two countries, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. However, without American support, that was never likely to happen. The South was simply too weak to defend itself. Nixon had promised to support the South in the event of an invasion from the North. President Thieu of South Vietnam signed the Accords under intense pressure from Nixon and Kissinger. However, in December 1974, just 4 months after Ford became president, North Vietnam invaded the South and took it over completely over the next 12 or 18 months. On the 21st of April 1975, President Thieu of South Vietnam resigned, and 2 days later, President Ford made a public statement that the Vietnam War was over as far as the United States was concerned. As South Vietnam collapsed, about 7,000 civilians, both American and Vietnamese, were rescued in the South Vietnamese capital, Saigon, in a mission called Operation Frequent Wind. This was the chaotic end to the Vietnam War. In May 1975, Ford achieved a minor victory in Asia. A new communist militia grouping known as the Khmer Rouge had overrun Cambodia. They attacked a US merchant ship, Mayaoos, and the Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, wanted to bomb Cambodia in reaction to this event. However, Ford decided on a more precise and restrained mission. He needed to take a firm stand in relation to the incident. A battle broke out between the Khmer Rouge fighters and US servicemen, and 41 servicemen were killed. Over 50 Khmer Rouge fighters were also killed in the battle. The US sailors on board the ship were quickly rescued, however, and the incident was seen as demonstrating Ford's ability to protect American interests while avoiding a major conflict. In fact, Ford's rating in the opinion polls following this incident went up by 11%. In regard to Asia, a small island north of Australia, Asia was a troubled region as well during this period. Ford and Kissinger met with the Indonesian President Suharto in December 1975. East Timor had recently declared its independence from Portugal. Suharto wanted to replace Portugal and discussed invasion plans of East Timor with Ford and Kissinger. A week later, the Indonesian military invaded East Timor but were met with fierce resistance from local fighters. The conflict actually lasted about 20 years, and horrendous conflict. 25% of the East Timor population were killed. Following the Vietnam experience, however, Ford was very reluctant to commit US forces to foreign conflicts. He had been criticised since by historians for not playing a more active role in restraining Indonesia. Eventually, international pressure forced Indonesia to grant a referendum to East Timor in 1999, and this eventually led to their independence in 2002, just 3 years later. In relation to near neighbour Canada, Ford sought to have Canada included in the G7 grouping of countries in 1975. Canada officially joined the G7 the following year, 1976. In relation to the domestic economy, Gerald Ford became president in 1974 at a time when inflation was running at over 12%. In fact, both inflation and unemployment were running very high during his presidency, a situation economists called stagflation. The rocketing oil prices of previous years had created this situation. High oil prices had impacted on every aspect of the economy, so everybody's talking about prices, and Ford supported the WIN campaign, the WIN campaign against inflation. The WIN campaign stood for Whip Inflation Now. Buttons were distributed everywhere. People were encouraged to spend less and produce more. However, after a couple of months, the campaign was found to be ineffective, and Ford switched courses under pressure from Congress, actually, and agreed to a major tax boost of the economy. This worked much better, as $22 billion were invested in the economy, creating 3 million extra jobs. However, this also resulted in a major increase of the federal debt. The population of the United States increased from 214 to 220 million, and 140 million of these people were working either full or part-time. Ford's was a very dramatic presidency in some ways. There was 2 assassination attempts on his life. Both took place in September 1975. The would-be assassins Lietta Fromm and Sarah Jane both failed in their attempts. However, they both served 30 years in prison. In regard to social issues, busing was a major divisive issue during the 1970s. The courts had ruled in previous years that schools must be integrated. That meant transferring children out of their area in order to meet various rules and quotas and standards. Boston in the state of Massachusetts became a particularly serious focal point, as violent mobs sometimes taunted children on their way to school. Ford believed this issue was best left to the individual states to sort out, rather than having the federal government becoming involved. In regard to New York City, he had a similar attitude towards the massive debt problem that state had created. At first, Ford totally refused to bail out the city. However, on further consideration, he changed his mind and approved a loan of over $2 billion for the city. In regard to his overall legacy, Ford is seen as a below-average president, mainly because he was never elected as president. After the Watergate affair, however, the public were demanding honesty and integrity in their public leaders. They got that in Gerald Ford. He was a straight, decent character, something America needed at the time. However, his pardon of Nixon was a major mistake. Opinion poll ratings dropped in the immediate aftermath of that from the high 60s to the high 30s, and it never really recovered. Ronald Reagan challenged him at the Republican Convention in 1976, and although Reagan failed in his attempt, he damaged Ford in the process. Jimmy Carter defeated him in November 76 in the election by a 2% margin, not much, just 51% to 49. But Carter won the Electoral College 279 to 241. It was a tough and tense election campaign, leading to strained relationships between the two men. However, Carter and Ford later became good friends later in life as ex-presidents. Ford holds a unique place in American history. He was the only president never elected as president or as vice president. Gerald Ford died in Grand Rapids, Michigan in 2006 at the age of 93.